Chicago, 1927. The city was ruled by fear, violence, and the rise of one man who would become a legend in the underworld. This is the story of Al Capone, his power, his tactics, and a single night that changed everything forever. In 1927, at the height of Prohibition, when Chicago's streets were ruled not by law but by money, fear, and silence, a quiet but deeply dangerous meeting took place just outside the city at a place known as the Hawthorne Smoke Shop. On the surface, it looked like an ordinary roadside establishment, a place where cigars were sold and conversations seemed harmless, but in reality, it was one of the most carefully chosen neutral grounds for America's most powerful underworld figures. Al Capone arrived that day not as a reckless gangster, but as a calculated ruler who understood that real power was exercised long before a gun was ever drawn. His arrival alone shifted the balance in the room, conversation softened, laughter faded, and eyes followed his every movement as he took his seat. Around him sat men who controlled bootlegging routes, gambling operations, protection rackets, and political connections stretching across Chicago and beyond, many of whom smiled politely while silently measuring whether Capone had grown too strong to tolerate. The purpose of the meeting was officially peace, a discussion of territory, profits, and boundaries, but beneath the formal words lay resentment, jealousy, and ambition that had been building for years. Several of the men present believed Capone's dominance over liquor distribution had gone too far, that his grip on politicians and police had turned him into a king rather than a partner, and that if he was not checked now, no one would ever challenge him again. As the meeting progressed, subtle remarks turned into sharper accusations, and one influential figure openly questioned Capone's claim over key bootlegging corridors, implying that Capone's power was based more on fear than fairness. The room grew colder, not because voices were raised, but because everyone understood the consequences of such words being spoken openly. Capone listened without interruption, his expression calm, his posture relaxed, as if the tension swirling around him was something he fully controlled. He did not deny the accusations, nor did he defend himself in detail. Instead, he allowed silence to stretch long enough for discomfort to settle into the bones of every man present. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and deliberate, reminding the room that chaos would destroy profits faster than any rival ever could, and that unity under one structure was the only reason the underworld had thrived as long as it had. Yet behind his calm tone was an unmistakable message: opposition was noted, remembered, and would be addressed in time. After the meeting ended, the men departed separately, each believing they had survived a critical confrontation, but none truly understanding what had been set into motion. In the days and weeks that followed, Capone's organization quietly gathered information, mapping alliances, identifying who had spoken too boldly, who had encouraged dissent, and who might be turned or eliminated. There were no immediate reprisals, no public displays of violence, which only deepened the anxiety among his rivals, because Capone was known to strike not in anger but with precision. Whispers spread through Chicago's speakeasies and back rooms that the Hawthorne meeting had changed everything, that lines had been crossed without blood being spilled, and that the consequences would arrive when least expected. Capone himself continued his public routine, attending events, meeting politicians, and expanding his businesses, giving the impression that the meeting had resolved tensions, while in reality it had merely clarified who stood where in the coming conflict. Behind closed doors, trusted lieutenants discussed timing, locations, and strategy, understanding that any response had to be overwhelming enough to end resistance permanently rather than provoke endless retaliation. The city remained unaware that a single gathering in a quiet smoke shop had set the stage for a transformation in the balance of power, one that would soon erupt into violence so shocking that it would redefine organized crime in America. As winter approached, relationships that once appeared stable began to fracture, alliances shifted without explanation, and certain names were spoken less frequently, as if mentioning them invited danger. Capone watched all of this unfold with patience, knowing that fear grows strongest in uncertainty, and that when the moment finally arrived, the impact would resonate far beyond the men who had dared to question him in that room, reaching into the heart of Chicago itself and altering the course of the underworld in ways that could no longer be reversed, while the true consequences of that meeting were still unfolding, unseen, and waiting for the exact moment to reveal themselves. The weeks following the Hawthorne Smoke Shop meeting, Al Capone moved silently but decisively, weaving a network of intelligence that extended into every corner of Chicago. He instructed his most loyal men to observe former allies and rivals alike, cataloging even the smallest misstep, a whispered insult, or a glance that conveyed disrespect. These observations were later cross-referenced with information gathered from street-level operatives who were embedded in rival gangs, saloons, and shipping warehouses, ensuring that no act of defiance went unnoticed. Capone's approach was methodical. He did not seek immediate vengeance but rather a slow, inescapable tightening of control. At the same time, word of the Hawthorne meeting began to travel, whispered in hushed tones throughout speakeasies and gambling dens. Those who had once considered opposing Capone found themselves hesitating in the streets, carefully calculating every move. Many of his rivals attempted to assert minor acts of rebellion, perhaps believing Capone's patience was weakness, but each incident was quietly neutralized without public bloodshed. One group tried to take over a small bootlegging route that had been Capone's since 1925, but before the first shipment could leave, Capone's enforcers intercepted it, leaving the rivals with a message that needed no words: loyalty was not negotiable. The psychological impact of these measures was profound. Men who had once been fearless in the face of violence found themselves second-guessing every conversation, every gesture, and every alliance. Capone understood that fear, more than bullets, could command obedience indefinitely, and that by demonstrating patience and strategic power, he could maintain dominance with minimal exposure. Meanwhile, the city itself was transforming. Political figures, law enforcement, and businessmen who had previously ignored or resisted Capone's influence began to adjust their behavior. Some sought to align themselves with him, hoping to benefit from the stability he enforced, while others quietly retreated, recognizing that even their wealth could not shield them from the consequences of standing against him. Capone had effectively turned the entire city into a chessboard, each piece moving under his scrutiny, each decision reinforcing his control over the territory he had claimed. Capone's personal involvement in these maneuvers was deliberate. He rarely attended street-level confrontations, preferring to orchestrate them from behind the scenes, observing human behavior and adjusting tactics in real time. When a rival attempted to intimidate one of his lieutenants, Capone responded not with immediate violence, but with strategic pressure. The rival's shipments were delayed, allies were subtly reassigned, and communication networks were disrupted until the rival had no choice but to comply. Each action reinforced the invisible but absolute authority Capone commanded, leaving observers with the unmistakable impression that resisting him was futile. As winter of 1927 deepened, Capone's reputation as both a visionary and a fearsome enforcer grew. Newspapers, under subtle pressure from political connections, reported only fragments of his activities, often focusing on his philanthropy or social appearances, leaving the public unaware of the intricate web of control he maintained in the underworld. Meanwhile, within the criminal ecosystem, Capone's decisions were studied, emulated, and feared, as even those with violent reputations recognized the unique combination of patience, intelligence, and ruthlessness that he wielded. And yet, the tension remained. Every day brought the potential for rebellion, betrayal, or miscalculation, and Capone knew that a single lapse could unravel years of meticulously built dominance. The Hawthorne Smoke Shop meeting, which at the time had seemed like a routine negotiation, had become the catalyst for a transformation in Chicago's underworld, a demonstration that power was not only about who could fire a gun, but who could command respect, manipulate perception, and enforce compliance with an almost invisible hand. With each passing month, the story of that night grew in legend. Men who had attended the meeting spoke in quiet tones of Capone's composure, the cold calculation behind his words, and the subtle signals that had ensured everyone left alive yet profoundly aware of their place. Even those who had never met him in person learned of the event through rumor, speculation, and fear, and the Hawthorne Smoke Shop became an unspoken symbol of Capone's intelligence and dominance. The days following the Hawthorne Smoke Shop meeting became a silent battlefield, where strategy and observation replaced open violence, and Al Capone's influence stretched into every shadowed corner of Chicago. He understood that true power was measured not in the number of enemies you defeated in a single gunfight, but in how many adversaries lived to fear you afterward. Every whisper, every glance, every footstep in the city was noted by his network of informants, carefully cultivated allies, and the ever-watchful lieutenants who ensured that no piece of information slipped through. Capone's approach was patient yet relentless. He allowed rumors of the meeting to spread, exaggerating the fear it instilled in rivals without revealing the full extent of his plans. Men who had once challenged his authority began to hesitate in their own operations, delaying shipments, second-guessing their alliances, and questioning the loyalty of their own men. Capone did not confront them openly. Instead, he orchestrated subtle moves that sent unmistakable signals: a shipment delayed here, an associate quietly removed there, a rival's territory reassigned without a word. Each action was a lesson in dominance, a quiet reminder that defiance had a cost far higher than anticipated. One particular incident highlighted the genius of Capone's psychological warfare. A mid-level gang leader, emboldened by the apparent calm following the Hawthorne meeting, attempted to move a series of illegal shipments through a route that had traditionally belonged to Capone's outfit. Unaware that his communications were being monitored, he planned the operation with confidence, believing Capone would not act without provocation. By the next day, every member of the leader's crew had received a subtle, yet unmistakable warning: shipments delayed, men reassigned, and a note delivered discreetly: respect the balance or face consequences. The gang leader realized that his challenge had been noted long before it was even enacted, and the lesson was clear: Capone's control was omnipresent, silent, and precise. Meanwhile, the larger network of gang affiliates, speakeasies, and political contacts began to shift in response. Capone's opponents no longer acted boldly; they whispered in corners, measuring every word, every gesture, afraid that even a minor slip could trigger repercussions. Capone himself maintained the appearance of normalcy. He appeared at social gatherings, philanthropic events, and public appearances, projecting the image of a man who was unbothered, untouchable, and in command. But beneath that veneer, the gears of an intricate plan were constantly turning, ensuring that loyalty was maintained, fear was reinforced, and potential rebellion was neutralized before it could grow. The Hawthorne Smoke Shop meeting, though brief in duration, had sparked a cascade of events that unfolded over months. Allies who had been indifferent suddenly became useful, and those who had been disloyal were quietly removed from positions of influence. Capone's lieutenants, trained in observation, strategy, and intimidation, became extensions of his will, executing orders with the precision of a military operation. Every territory, every shipment, every political connection was now under scrutiny, and every decision was part of a larger plan to consolidate power and maintain absolute dominance. By late 1927, the city's criminal landscape had shifted noticeably. Rival gangs that had once operated openly now moved cautiously, aware that Capone's reach was invisible but omnipresent. Even men who had never encountered him in person spoke with deference, sharing stories of the Hawthorne meeting as cautionary tales: how one night in a small smoke shop had altered the balance of power, how a single conversation had instilled fear and obedience across the entire underworld, and how Capone had achieved dominance not with immediate bloodshed, but with calculated foresight and psychological mastery. Every encounter, every negotiation, and every minor dispute in Chicago's criminal ecosystem from that point forward carried the shadow of that night. Capone had set a precedent: power could be absolute without a single gun fired, and loyalty could be demanded with nothing more than careful observation, strategic pressure, and subtle intimidation. The Hawthorne meeting became legendary, referenced in whispered conversations, in back rooms of speakeasies, and in police reports that struggled to piece together the scope of Capone's influence. As winter deepened, Capone's empire not only survived but thrived, while rivals learned to measure their actions against his silent authority. The city was transformed into a chessboard, with Capone always several moves ahead. Each man who had attended the meeting carried in his mind the memory of Capone's composed demeanor, the precision of his words, and the quiet force of his presence, understanding that the repercussions of that night would unfold gradually, ensuring compliance, respect, and fear for years to come. Even now, the Hawthorne Smoke Shop meeting is remembered not for the violence that could have occurred, but for the demonstration of control, patience, and calculated dominance. Capone showed the world that leadership in the criminal underworld was as much about the mind as it was about muscle, that a single event could shape loyalties, influence territories, and change the course of organized crime in a major city. The echoes of that night continued to reverberate long after the men had left, forming the backbone of Capone's legend as one of the most feared and intelligent figures in the history of American crime. As the cold Chicago winter of 1927 progressed, the full impact of the Hawthorne Smoke Shop meeting became increasingly evident. The city's underworld had changed permanently. Rival gangs, once brazen and confident, now navigated the streets with caution, aware that Capone's influence extended far beyond immediate violence. His reputation for calculating patience had become a silent law, shaping behavior without a single bullet being fired in public. Capone, meanwhile, leveraged this psychological dominance to solidify his empire, ensuring that every member of his organization, from the lowliest bootlegger to his most trusted lieutenants, understood the principles of loyalty, obedience, and calculated risk. Capone's meticulous approach extended beyond enforcement. He began to consolidate control over the distribution of alcohol, carefully mapping the routes, suppliers, and territories that had once been contested. Meetings that might have erupted into violent confrontations were transformed into orchestrated negotiations, where Capone's mere presence served as a deterrent. Allies learned quickly that their success depended on following his rules, while rivals were subtly, but unmistakably, reminded of the consequences of defiance. By exerting power through strategy, influence, and timing rather than open gunfire, Capone not only preserved lives within his circle but also maintained a level of operational efficiency that few criminal organizations could rival. One particularly tense moment arose when two rival factions attempted to encroach on a profitable shipping route on the outskirts of the city. The leaders, unaware that Capone had already intercepted communications between them, believed they were acting covertly. In reality, Capone had anticipated the move for weeks. Without a public confrontation, he orchestrated a series of maneuvers that isolated the factions from their allies, disrupted their shipments, and left them facing internal dissent. The message was delivered silently yet clearly: Chicago's criminal ecosystem operated under Capone's rules, and any attempt to circumvent them would be met with swift and inescapable consequences. The influence of the Hawthorne meeting extended even to law enforcement and political circles. Police officers, judges, and city officials who had previously attempted to challenge or ignore Capone now recognized the subtle, pervasive force he wielded. Bribes, alliances, and strategic favors ensured that his operations continued largely uninterrupted, while those who resisted quietly faded from relevance. Capone's genius lay in the perception of omnipotence. No open confrontation was necessary when everyone believed he was watching, listening, and controlling every move. Within his own organization, the psychological lessons of the Hawthorne meeting were constantly reinforced. New members were taught the story as an example of strategic control, how one night, a simple gathering had demonstrated the limits of defiance, the power of observation, and the effectiveness of subtle intimidation. Veterans of the outfit recounted the tale repeatedly, ensuring that even those who had not attended understood the weight of Capone's authority. The meeting became more than an event; it became doctrine, shaping decision-making, loyalty, and behavior for years to come. As 1928 approached, Capone's empire was stronger than ever. His ability to navigate complex networks of criminals, businessmen, and politicians allowed him to expand operations with minimal disruption. The Hawthorne Smoke Shop meeting, once a single event, had evolved into a symbol of his dominance, a masterclass in strategy, and a defining chapter in his career. Every rival, every subordinate, and even casual observers learned that Capone's leadership was not built on sheer violence alone. It was a combination of intelligence, foresight, psychological mastery, and the careful orchestration of events that ensured his supremacy. In the end, the legend of that night lived on far beyond the walls of the smoke shop. Men who had once scoffed at the idea of Capone's patience and calculation now spoke with awe and fear. Rivals altered their operations to avoid provoking him. Allies knew that loyalty was not optional but essential to survival. The streets of Chicago, once chaotic and unpredictable, had become a testament to Capone's methodical approach to power, where every move was anticipated, every action observed, and every consequence measured. The Hawthorne Smoke Shop meeting was more than just a confrontation; it was a turning point. It illustrated the rise of a man whose combination of strategy, fear, and vision transformed the city's underworld forever. Al Capone's ability to convert a potentially deadly night into a lesson in obedience and dominance ensured that his legend would be remembered not merely for violence, but for the unparalleled mastery of power and control. That night became the cornerstone of his reputation, the story passed down through whispers in alleyways, bars, and offices alike, reminding everyone that in the game of organized crime, true power lies in the mind as much as in the gun.